Hello, everybody, and welcome back from lunch. My name is Daniel Jeffries, and I'm with the Tulsa Planning Office. This session, Highways to Boulevards, Stories from Across America and What They Mean for Tulsa, is sponsored by TSED. It will discuss some of the negative effects of the construction of the federal interstate highway system, lessons learned from cities that have successfully removed highways, and will explore how highway removal could help build a more equitable Tulsa. I'm pleased to introduce our speaker, Ben Crowther. Ben is the program manager for the Congress for the New Urbanism's Highways to Boulevards and Freeways Without Futures initiatives. As a reminder, if you have any questions or comments, please add them to the Q&A box on your screen and we will answer them at the end of the presentation.
Well, hello, everyone. I'm Ben Crowther. I'm the program manager for the Congress for the New Urbanism's Highways to Boulevards initiative. Before I start, I just want to thank a few people first, including Louisa Krug for inviting me to speak here today, Jabbar Shumante for his insights into Greenwood past and present, and our moderator, Daniel Jeffries, who I'm sure will recognize many of the photos that I included in this presentation. And I'll also echo Daniel as well. As I'm presenting, please feel free to post any questions you have to the Q&A, and we'll return to them at the end of this. So what are Highways to Boulevards projects, and how do they relate to unraveling the inequity in our streets? In one sentence, they're projects that rebuild cities by removing highways. Highways to Boulevards projects offer a way for people who live near highways to repair and reknit their communities. They articulate community visions for a neighborhood without the highway, transforming broken liabilities and righting historical wrongs. They're not a silver bullet for community restoration, but they do begin to address many of the underlying inequalities in the built environment, primarily those created by car-centered decision-making. So I'm going to show you later several examples of cities that have successfully undertaken Highways to Boulevards projects and talk about the outcomes that they've achieved. But I like to always start with saying that the story of highway removal begins with the story of highway building. And since we're here in Tulsa, wish we could be there in Tulsa, or personally myself at least, let's start by looking at I-244, particularly the section that runs through Greenwood. If you were here for Phil Armstrong's presentation earlier today, we covered this a bit on that history with I-244 in Greenwood. I want to go for a little bit of a deeper dive as we think about how highway removal could change parts of Tulsa. I-244 through Greenwood is the northern portion of Tulsa's interdispersal loop, which, as you can see here, it effectively creates a moat that separates downtown from the rest of the city. The highway is a bypass for Interstate 44, which runs a few miles to the south. I-244 through Greenwood is also the site of historic Black Wall Street, the thriving Black business district that 100 years ago was burnt to the ground by a mob of white Tulsans and killed at least 100 people and destroyed the 2019 equivalent of over $32 million worth of property. Here's Greenwood today. It's largely defined by the highway, vacant lots to the north, and the campuses of Oklahoma State University, Tulsa, and Langston University. Only a pair of churches and a single city block of historic Black Wall Street remain. So how did it get this way? One common misconception, and Phil touched on this earlier, that I came across while doing research for this talk, is that the current state, these vacant lots, are the result of the race massacre. But that's not the case. It's the result of the highway and the program of urban renewal that came with it. Here's a view of that sole remaining block, the 100 block of North Greenwood, with I-244 running through it. And here's a view of that same block of Black Wall Street from a similar perspective in 1938. That's 17 years after the destruction of the race massacre, but 27 years before the construction of the highway. After the massacre, Greenwood's Black community had quickly reestablished itself and returned even more triumphant. We know from directories that in 1942, Greenwood was home to 242 Black-owned businesses spread over 35 square blocks. And that included over 50 restaurants, 38 grocers, a half dozen clothing stores, florists, physicians, attorneys, theaters, etc., i.e. a complete neighborhood. With the end of legal segregation in the early 1960s, Greenwood's businesses had experienced a bit of decline because Black spending was no longer concentrated exclusively in this district, but it still was very much a source of community pride. Here's an aerial photo from 1951 with the future route of I-244 drawn over it, where construction started in 1965. And you can see here exactly what was destroyed to make way for the highway. These are homes, these are businesses, places people live and work. In addition to the highway's construction, the city of Tulsa used funding from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development's Model Cities program to clear around another 85 acres of Greenwood, a lot of which still remains vacant, i.e. those vacant lots. The two projects ultimately, together, they forced around 2,200 of Greenwood's residents from their homes. So this is how the Greenwood on the right came to be. A decision that valued the convenience and mobility of largely white commuters over the Black community that stood in its path. Now, this isn't to say that the construction of I-244 didn't damage other communities in Tulsa too, it did. To the east, I-244 drastically transformed the neighborhood along Admiral Boulevard and Admiral Place. But much of the wealth that Tulsa's Black community had accumulated since the race massacre was concentrated in Greenwood. And because of discriminatory lending and housing practices, its residents had limited options for relocation elsewhere in the city. So I-244's construction had an outsized impact on Black Tulsans who saw effectively the state-sponsored destruction of a community focal point. Sadly, the story of I-244 in Tulsa is emblematic of the larger history of American transportation investments during the second half of the 20th century. This mural by Judy Baca captures the consequences of highway building for the residents of LA's Chavez Ravine, a story familiar to many other communities of color in American cities. Highways replaced homes and separate families, and you can see that here quite literally with the pylons of the highway driven through the homes below them, and the families reaching out to each other. In this process, longtime residents are forced to move, and they experience the trauma of having the place they live in destroyed, the disintegration of their social networks, and new economic hardships caused by relocation. A total number of people that highway construction displaced has never been calculated. The records are kind of spotty, actually, but estimates and available data suggest we're looking at least 1 million people, if not more, from across the entire country. Why were communities of color so often targeted by highway construction? Well, it's built into the system. We're looking here at the Homeowners Loan Corporation maps that were produced start from the 1930s onwards of Tulsa that is documented effectively the system of redlining. And this is a government-backed process which valued or devalued property largely based on the racial composition of a neighborhood. But it's also influencing the path of highway construction. Because the properties owned by Black and Brown Americans were undervalued, it cost less for the government to acquire when seized as to become part of a highway's right-of-way. So building highways through communities of color become the logical choice for highway builders. So we come to the present day, and although the era of interstate construction is past, the story of these highways isn't over yet. I-244 is still very much a burden on Greenwood. You can see in this picture here, it's a literal insurmountable hill with speeding cars on top that continue to drive fast even after they get off the highway, putting pedestrians, cyclists, and other drivers at risk. It's a barrier, It limits the ability of North Tulsa residents to easily walk or bike to downtown. And it subjects those who live and work around it to vehicle noise and exhaust. We can keep going. It adds no value to the surrounding area. In fact, it often drives disinvestment. But what if there was a way forward without it that removes these negative effects I just talked about and served as a reparative program to help heal from the destruction of Greenwood? Here's another city with a downtown highway loop. This is Rochester, New York. In 2017, Rochester removed the eastern portion of its inner loop, which you can see here on the right side of this satellite image. Rochester is one of the most recent additions to the growing highways to boulevards movement. So far, cities across America have opted 15 times to remove or cover highways and replace them with streets, public spaces, and buildings that are dedicated to people, not cars. Although these projects vary greatly in some cases in magnitude and scope, they produce largely similar positive outcomes in 4 key areas. We're talking about the public realm, we're talking about health and environment, connectivity, and economic development. Each of these communities, when they chose to undertake these projects, they've opted to measure community progress and quality of life by a set of metrics other than travel times. And there are another 30 or so cities out there today where serious conversations are taking place about removing or covering a highway, adding to this growing highways to boulevards movement. So what's Rochester gained since they removed the east side of the inner loop 4 years ago? Well, to start, as you can see here, the city's been able to reclaim about 6.5 acres of land from the highway. And they rebuilt Union Street as a new spine for the neighborhood that links essentially downtown to the periphery. Rochester started to build out on this land. The city spent $22 million to remove what was roughly half a mile stretch of the inner loop. This was funded primarily through a federal Tiger grant, some state funds, and a small amount of local funds as well. But in the first 2 years alone, so this is from 2017 to 2019, this $22 million public investment spurred $229 million in economic development in the project area. And for what it's worth, I should mention this as well, the projected life cycle cost for maintenance and repairs for that same section of the highway, if it was to be rebuilt, would have been $34 million. So we're talking, it's $12 million more than the cost to remove it. And all this activity has produced a lot of new opportunities for Rochester and the people who live around what's now Union Street. In terms of employment, the projects created 170 new permanent jobs and around 2,000 construction jobs so far. But this isn't all just about making money. So the city set out from the start to steer development and fund amenities that make the neighborhood more inclusive and increase access to opportunity and services. And it's largely been able to do so because it can leverage the expected economic development that I just mentioned to address community concerns. Things like housing and affordability as a primary concern. The Inner Loop East transformation has started to tackle this by adding 534 new housing units to Rochester, more than half of which are subsidized or below market rate. The projects also added 152,000 square feet of commercial space, but this isn't just for any businesses, but rather businesses that neighborhood residents said they were lacking. Things like a pharmacy and a daycare center. The city, when it went out to undertake this project, made sure to include from the start the community that lived around it and really wanted to hear from them about what sort of services they wanted to see developed on these properties. And the transformation project has also funded social programs. So this includes things like providing homes for ex-offenders re-entering the workforce, for people living with HIV, and seniors requiring assistance. And finally, the Inner Loop East Transformation Project, it's also changed how people get around and how they use the street. Union Street features ample sidewalks, two-way protected bike lanes, signaled crosswalks, bike racks, benches, trees, landscaping, all the things that make a street attractive and make people want to go out and be on the street. And this too has paid dividends. So between 2014 and 2019, walking has increased by 50% and biking by 60% in the project area. This also then decreases the reliance on cars and the costs that come with them, both financial and other. So I've said a lot of positive things about the Rochester project so far, but of course it isn't perfect. But the city right now is actually looking at exploring the removal of the northern section of the inner loop, building on that progress, and looking to apply the lessons learned from the inner loop east transformation based on the feedback it's got from its residents. One desire in particular is to turn some of the highways right of way, if they do choose to go and remove the inner loop north, into community gathering space, an option that the city's actually already exploring, as you can see from the rendering here. And another significant finding is that residents' desire for housing that better fits different living situations. So you saw in the previous slides, the mostly 4-story buildings full of 1- and 2-bedroom apartments. And that doesn't address the needs of all community members, even if they include affordable units. This is particularly true for families. And so residents, as Rochester moves forward with Inner Loop North, they want to see a mix of housing types, including smaller homes, things like duplexes that are often described as missing middle housing. So I hope you can see that highway removal has the power to be transformative. But how can we harness that power of these sorts of projects to forward racial equity and heal from the destruction that's been wrought by highway building? Well, there are many benefits to highways to boulevards projects. There are also some risks. The removal of a highway has a very real potential to cause displacement through gentrification. It goes like something like this. The proximity to a highway artificially decreases property values. So when you remove it, you can expect to see those properties values rise, and in some cases soar. And residents who are living around the highway may not be able to afford that increased cost. This is the Mandela Parkway in West Oakland. In 1989, Interstate 880 used to run down the central median before it collapsed during the Loma Prieta earthquake. When Caltrans went to rebuild the highway, the members of the community rallied against this idea for the second time. They were against it to start with. And they convinced Caltrans to reroute the highway to the edge of the neighborhood rather than directly through it. And Mandela Parkway is built in its place. And so between 1990, when the highway is removed, and 2010, in a period of 20 years, median home values within 250 meters of the Mandela Parkway increased by 184% once the highway is gone. At the same time, there's a substantial decrease in the Black population living around the former highway corridor. In 1990, Black people made up around 73% of the overall population living within that 250-meter stretch of the parkway. And in 2020, that number comes down to 44.5%, a total decline of around 28%. And that's 5% above the baseline rate for the rest of West Oakland, which has also experienced a lot of gentrification during those years. So during this time, Oakland, when they started this removal, they did little to protect against this sort of environmental gentrification other than passive strategies, like they left the area around the northern portion of the Mandela Parkway zoned for industrial and mixed use to discourage large-scale residential development. But they didn't take any sort of active steps to making sure that they could keep residents in place. So this should serve, I think, as a cautionary tale for how to go about highway removal or highway transportation. We really need to be proactive to ensure that the benefits unlocked by taking down an expressway are channeled to the people who live and work alongside it now, as well as those who it has historically affected most. What principles could a city like Tulsa adopt to pursue highway removal that puts equity at the fore and rights some of the wrongs inflicted by highway building? We at the Congress for New Urbanism, we've been working on developing a set of 4 principles for equitable highways to boulevards projects that balance investments in the built environment and infrastructure with investments in people. The first of these principles is that the project needs to be rooted in community priorities. Too often, communities only have the opportunity to respond to proposals to alter a highway, not create their own. And this includes both highway expansion projects as well as removal projects. Community feedback solicited after alternatives have already been proposed, which limits the capacity for change and undervalues the lived experience of residents. To remedy this problem, project funding should be made available to community-based organizations from the start to gather meaningful input from residents and determine what their vision for the future of the highway corridor might be before the physical planning process even starts. Letting the community lead also helps prevent a project from becoming a top-down imposition like much past and present highway building. In the way we've historically have built transportation infrastructure, particularly in the second half of the 20th century, has created a lot of serious barriers to meaningful engagement and getting buy-in from legacy residents, particularly those of color. Some of them may reject highways to boulevards projects as a second round of government-sponsored displacement. And if we look back to, say, the Mandela Parkway, they wouldn't exactly be wrong there. So state and local governments in these projects, they need to demonstrate that they can and will follow through on the promises to unlock the benefits of highway removal for existing community members and build out their vision. I think also it's worth saying that the community needs to be involved not just at the start, but through the entire conversion process to ensure follow through. So this includes things like the establishment of a community advisory board that can act in an official capacity to oversee the project as it progresses, with the power to intervene if things become questionable. Second, we need new metrics to shape streets that replace highways. And we've learned this lesson at the national level. Over the last several years, there have been a number of subpar highway removal projects where the street that replaces the highway basically retains the highway-like qualities. And this is because state departments of transportation design highways to boulevards projects to fulfill outdated metrics like level of service, things that can only measure a road's capacity to move cars quickly. But that's not the purpose of the streets that are built to replace highway. So you see here, this is Chattanooga's Riverfront Parkway, which used to be a highway, a limited access highway, and now has the flexibility to do much more than just move cars. Street designs that include cars, but don't make them the highest priority are key here. These streets need to have fewer lanes with well-proportioned sidewalks, frequent and well-signed crossing, ideally street trees, and one or more medians that create an avenue that serves more than just vehicle traffic, but is comfortable to walk on, to bike on, for anyone, regardless of who they are, to be able to move through that area without being burdened. So highways to boulevards projects need an updated set of metrics to promote this type of street design. These sort of projects should have to reduce the amount of vehicle miles traveled so they don't replicate the environmental injustices that a highway inflicts now. And any requirements to meet a level of service threshold should ideally be waived. Otherwise, you're just going to create the same type of road that you already have, one that's dangerous. We can replace level of service with things like multimodal accessibility scores. These combine transportation and land use data to evaluate the number of people who can easily access jobs and services in a project area. This helps ensure that land uses along the new street are planned to work in tandem with the divestment from highway infrastructure. Next, highways to boulevards projects need to invest in holistic neighborhood repair. At its core, highway removal is more than just a transportation issue. It intersects with housing and affordability, economic development, and access to jobs and service. environmental justice and public health, racial equity, and community development. So holistic neighborhood repair starts with identifying the assets that already exist locally and would be even stronger without the highway. And I want to come back to Phil's presentation at the beginning of the day, looking at what are those assets that exist in Deep Greenwood. Some may be businesses like Treme Market Branch. This is on the screen here. And this is a locally owned event space alongside the Claiborne Expressway in New Orleans. If decision makers are serious about revitalization through highway removal, they need to channel the benefits of it towards these sorts of existing assets first, ones that help develop community engagement and create whole neighborhoods. This is an investment in people, not just infrastructure. So how could this apply to Tulsa? The removal of I-244 on its own won't restore Black Wall Street. But coordinated reparative programs coupled with the highway's removal could support community efforts to build a new Black Wall Street. The removal of the highway would open new land to expand Deep Greenwood northward, where it's largely constrained by the highway's presence. Well, the city could invest in programs to aid the development of new Black-owned businesses and boost existing ones. It's going to take focused investments and intentional policies like these to achieve holistic neighborhood repair. And last, but far, far from least, projects need to take proactive steps to prevent the displacement of legacy residents. They're the ones who have persevered through the disinvestment the highways caused, and they're pillars of the community, so they need to receive priority. Part of a project's funding should be made available for displacement protections that take effect before construction even begins and speculators start to snatch up property. Like designs for what comes after the highway, there's no one-size-fits-all solution here when it comes to combating displacement. Protections to keep current residents in their homes could include tax abatements for property owners, first-time home buyer programs to give tenants an actual stake in the land, leveraging programs like Tulsa's Affordable Housing Trust to create affordable homes within walking distance to a project area, and establishing a community land trust to rehabilitate vacant lots and abandoned houses in line with residents' interests. Those four things are, that's a short list, that's far from exhaustive. But what's really important, I think, is that the cities that initiate these projects tackle displacement from the start and help residents build wealth before the market appreciates. So here are 4 principles to guide highways to boulevards projects. I just want to end with a little bit of context from the past year. I think the events of 2020 really demonstrated the increasing need for additional conversions that follow these principles. We saw in the early stages of the pandemic a drastic drop in driving that exposed existing shortfalls in highway maintenance budgets and really exacerbated the problem of the funding schemes that already struggled to pay for highways. So financially, they're a liability, but they're also very much a social liability. I mean, it's little surprise that racial justice protest movements occupy highways, given the racist legacy behind their construction and the spatial inequalities they continue to perpetuate today. I want to emphasize, though, that highways to boulevards projects will not yield all the benefits promised unless they are driven by, and designed in partnership with the communities that live around them. These residents are not only the people most impacted by the project, but they also lived with the day-to-day, the ongoing trauma of residing in a neighborhood severely damaged by federal infrastructure that doesn't benefit them. So as more and more state and local agencies take up highway removal projects, it's essential that they achieve outcomes that reverse the effects of highway building. A successful project, a successful highway removal project, will bring benefits to cities through the economic empowerment of disinvested communities rather than at their expense, like last century's transportation infrastructure. I'll pause here, but I encourage you all to visit our website for additional resources about highways to boulevards projects, and also as well be on the lookout for the 7th edition of CNU's Freeways Without Futures report that's going to be released on June 1st, so a few weeks from now. In addition, a final shameless plug, CNU's annual meeting will be just down the road in Oklahoma City. This is March 23rd through 26th, 2022. So save the date. We'll certainly be continuing this conversation there, so I hope that many of you can join us. And finally, my email's here, and please do reach out. I'm always happy to chat. So let's go ahead and dive into some questions.
Thank you, Ben. It looks like we've got a question or a comment rather from Barbara mentioning Clyde Warren Park in Dallas. It was a recessed highway that they built a park over the top of. So I just wanted to mention that, get your thoughts on that if you're familiar with it.
Yeah, I think it's been a really successful project in terms of demonstrating the sort of economic development that can come out of highway transformation. And let's call it transformation because that's not a true removal. We're effectively, well, sort of greening over the problem of infrastructure, but it is an improvement to the neighborhood, no doubt. Clyde Warren Park is a very popular place, but it's also had some of the similar effects that the Mandela Parkway has had, in that it raises property values around it, immensely. So I think that's also should be a little bit of a cautionary tale, but also, it shows the transformative power that projects like these can have.
Brent asks how other cities have handled traffic flow changes created by highway removal and how they've managed the increased traffic flow using different arterials, or maybe there are alternative routes.
Yeah, so this is I think a common question, particularly community members ask this all the time, right? Like a highway is carrying, depending on the highway, give or take 60,000 plus cars a day. Some of them are in the hundreds of thousands. So what happens, to the traffic when you take that major road away? And we've seen results, particularly out of San Francisco, Seattle as well. Seattle's Alaska Way Viaduct, it was demolished in 2019. It carried about 90,000 cars a day. And Seattle also built a tunnel to replace this highway. That tunnel wasn't going to be open for at least a month or so after the highway was demolished. So there's a period of 30 days where 90,000 cars, something has to happen to them. And there's no Carmageddon. What happens instead is there's a slight uptick in commuter times, across the city, but this is no more than a couple minutes. There's increased biking, increased walking, like we saw with the Rochester project. But it became really hard for the city engineers to account for where this traffic all went. And what it seemed like is a lot of people just chose to skip trips. They reconsidered whether they needed to go, out to, a store to buy a single item, things like that. They condensed trips in trip chaining. So San Francisco saw this play out on a larger scale when it's removed two of its highways, both of which carried around between, I think it was 70,000 to 90,000 cars a day. A similar sort of thing happened. We really, though, one thing that we do need to do more of is look into the actual data for where these cars go. There's a study out there around the removal of the Central Freeway in San Francisco that did some polling of people who used the freeway and what they did afterwards. And a lot of them said they just took a different route, but traffic was dispersed across the city rather than concentrated on this single road. So the effects weren't really felt as seriously.
And I think that's something we've seen here in Tulsa too, with the construction of the Gathering Place, a large riverfront park. The city closed a portion of Riverside Drive, and traffic did increase on some surrounding arterial streets, namely Peoria, but I don't think it was nearly as much as people expected.
One thing I didn't mention, but that's rather important, is if a city's going to undertake a project, Highways to Boulevards project, ideally you're coupling that, you're disinvesting from cars divesting from cars, but ideally you couple that with an investment in some other form of getting around, public transportation, something like that. And these highway right-of-ways are so large that it's actually relatively easy to do that, build things like a dedicated bus lane or whatnot.
Speaking of the right of way needed for these highways, Dwayne asks, typically in Tulsa, abandoned street right of way is sold to adjoining property owners at some market rate. So, can you talk about who ends up with ownership of that abandoned highway right of way? How have other cities dealt with that whenever the land that was owned by the public now suddenly is available for purchase?
Yeah, so there's been, it's usually a form of negotiation with the State Department of Transportation, which in the majority of cases owns these facilities, and usually with the city as a public entity. So in the case of Rochester, for instance, the New York State DOT essentially just gifted the land back. There have been a few other instances of, where things don't go so smoothly, and this is something to, I think, very much be aware of as you're thinking about these projects. Who will get ownership of the land back? In Milwaukee, with the removal of the Park East Freeway, it ended up being the county and not the city that got the land back, and that made for a bit of a jurisdictional nightmare. The county stalled on the development of a lot of those lots, and it's only, something like it was in the decades, like 10, 15 years before the build out actually happened. Well, things were settled legally. I know down in Texas, with Dallas, for instance, they're considering removing I-345 there. And TxDOT has said to the city, we'll sell you back the land at market rate, which is, sort of a hard ask for a city, considering that that property will cost a lot. So it's one of the things I think it will vary on situation, but that's know before you go, certainly, and look into what exactly will happen with regards to ownership.
Well, it looks like we are out of time, unfortunately. But Ben, thank you so much for the presentation. Apologize for the technical difficulties, but also thank you to everyone who asked questions. There are a few more that we weren't able to get to, but I'm sure we'll have an opportunity to talk again. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you all for joining. And like I said, feel free to email me. It's good to be here.